Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's session of Stories That Made Us, South Asian for Pioneers. As you're aware, this event is part of the month-long event of highlighting and showcasing stories and other cultural events that relate to South Asians in Britain today. So this morning, before I start, actually, I should introduce myself. I'm Councillor Kindy Sandhu, and I have the honour today of chairing the session this morning. I'm Councillor for Earlsdon Ward, and I'm Cabinet Member for Education and Skills. So today's session, we're really going to be talking about this fabulous book, which is called Pioneer, the Life Story of Tara Singh. And the person who edited the book is his son, Karamjit Singh, who has joined us this morning. Let me just introduce you to Karamjit Singh. Karamjit Singh is born and brought up in Coventry. He's always lived in Coventry. He's the eldest of 7 siblings, 7 children of Tara Singh. His career has crossed many different parts of the public sector, both at regional and national levels. He's always been interested in migration, heritage, and identity issues. So before we start, let me just give you a few housekeeping things. So we are recording the session this morning. So if you don't feel comfortable with your image being recorded, then please turn your video cameras off. We're also at various points going to take screenshots because we'd like to tell other people more about the session today. And so we'll be putting that on social media. Now, at the bottom, you'll see a chat function, and that chat function is for any questions that you may choose that you want to ask, or indicate that you would like to ask a question. And finally, please turn your mobiles off, just for ease of the session this morning. So basically, over the next hour, we're going to first of all hear from Karamjit, who's going to give us a synopsis of the book, if you like, and read some excerpts from the book, excerpts that he feels are particularly poignant to the story of his father. And then it's an opportunity for us to really, that includes me, to ask Karamjit questions really about not only his father's story, but his father's story within the context of migration and identity. So, thank you, Karamjit, first of all, for writing this wonderful book. I was wondering if you could please just start off by giving us a synopsis of the book.
Yeah, I mean, the origin of this book was in 1971, in fact, July the 26th, 1971. I started my first role as a research associate at Warwick University, and it was to work on a project dealing with looking at migrant workers in the foundry industry. And obviously, a significant number of workers there were of South Asian, particularly Punjabi origin. And I started talking to my father, and I sort of said, well, you know, why did you migrate, etc. He started talking about it. So I said, well, why didn't you write it down? And he basically got exercise books and started writing it down in order to, and this is no mean feat for someone who left school at the age of 14. So that was the kind of background. I think I've always been, because I think he raised, like many parents, he raised us to think about, even though we're born here, think about our background and heritage. And I think the resilience and the principles and the hard work that he and all his generation, who were pioneers in a real sense, because they came, they established our communities here. I mean, I think is really important. I think the one thing that has struck me is that, and so I basically, I have to say, I just held that material for over 40 years. And it was only when I sort of realized that actually I need to do something about this, because I wanted my children and grandchildren, etc., to understand it. So really, I then got it translated into English, and I've added an explanatory material, which is why I'm simply an editor. A lot of it is very much in my father's own words, basically, recollections. And so it deals with, I mean, he was born in May 1914 in a village called Dadial in Hoshiarpur district in Punjab, time of the British Raj. Very hard upbringing because his father had died in Kenya when he was only 10 months old. So he never saw his father. He had no brothers and sisters. He had to leave school at the age of 14 to farm because of grinding poverty. And his mother, my grandmother, went blind from cataracts when he was only 15. So he then sort of migrates to Kenya at the age of 23 in 1937. And a year later follows his cousin here to the UK in 1938 and comes to Coventry in 1940, which is where he settles, basically. My mother came here in 1948, and interestingly, she was one of the first 3 South Asian women in Coventry at the time. So my father retires in 1979, goes back to India to work on the farm that he'd also purchased. And sadly, he passed away in November 1986, only 5 days in India on the farm, only 5 days after he'd returned from the UK. So I've sort of, you know, and he worked in this country, he worked as a peddler, he worked as a foundry worker, and in 1959, he was employed by the city council here as a car park attendant. And I think he was probably, if not the first, certainly probably one of the very few BAME employees in the council. So, and I see this book not just about the issue of migration identity in terms of us as South Asians. I see this as a contribution to British social history because we're part of this society as well. And the final thing I'd say, just in introduction, is that I have not come across any other first-hand oral history of someone from that particular group. I think there are oral histories of people who've come later, but I've not come across anything myself. And there may well be work out there. I've just not seen it. And perhaps what I thought I'd do was to I'd pick out 4 excerpts which deal with migration and identity, and also partition, because I think in terms of South Asian Heritage Month, these appear to be the 3 themes this year. And just on identity, I'd like to the excerpts I've picked is really how individuals try to maintain their identity, how they try to do it through their friendships, and how they try to do it through organised activity. So those are the things I'm going to try and pick up. So if I just read some very short passages from the book. When he set sail from Kenya, he said, the ship on which I had arranged my passage to the French port of Marseille set sail from Mombasa on the 26th of September 1938. He was very meticulous about dates and the ship was owned by a French company, so there were very few people on board the ship who could understand English. That evening, I went down to the kitchens to have my evening meal. The cook poured rice on my plate and then began to put beef with gravy on top of the rice. While he was doing this, I kept saying no, repeatedly, English and Swahili, but he could not understand either, and he did not stop. I took my plate and scooping the meat up onto the top deck and scooping the meat up with a spoon, I threw it into the ocean. I scooped up all the rice with gravy onto it, into the ocean as well. This left only a small amount of dry rice on my plate and the cup of tea, which consisted of boiled black water without any milk or sugar. So he then sort of says that basically this goes on. He says, this interaction between myself and the cook was like a pantomime with each of us talking to each other and making gestures, but not understanding the other. I spent 5 complete days in this manner. So without having anything approaching a full meal on any occasion during that time. When my ship docked at the port of Aden, which is a British colony at that time, I was pleased to see another Sikh coming onto the ship And when he boarded, we said Sat Sri Akal respectfully to each other. I learnt his name was Saudagar Singh, and I laid his charpoy next to mine and kept our luggage together. When we went downstairs to the kitchen, Saudagar Singh took hold of the cook's hand and began to look at his palm and said, "Good," in English. The cook sent one of his assistants to bring the head storeman who could speak English. He translated what Saudagar Singh was saying as he examined the cook's palm. We were also able to explain to the cook I was a vegetarian, did not eat eggs, and apart from the beef, I also did not want the meat gravy on my rice. After this, the cook would pour rice on my plate and then put sugar on top, and he would give us oranges and grapes in great quantities. This is the first time I had a full meal in a period of nearly 6 days. And then he says, we docked at Marseille on the morning of the 18th day of the voyage, which was the 13th of October, 1938. And if you think around that sort of time, this is when the Munich Agreement and all these kind of momentous events were beginning to happen in Europe. Waiting for us at the dockside was Saudagar Singh's cousin, who was in Marseille because he was shortly going to travel to India. He arranged for our passports to be stamped, and he accompanied us to the house of a person called Monsieur Bassin. This person acted as an agent for travellers and assisted them in all matters relating to formalities of their travel. And he basically, this chap helps them to buy the tickets, and he says that Monsieur Bassin bought our tickets for our entire travel from Marseille through to London Victoria railway station and charged us £4 10 shillings for his service. He took us to Marseille railway station, made sure we were seated on the overnight train to Paris, which was leaving that evening. He gave us some bread, butter and cheese, which we could eat if we became hungry on our journey. I'd never eaten cheese before, and I did not like such food at the time when I tasted it. Because neither Saudagar Singh nor myself could speak any French, he wrote down the name of the other railway station in Paris we would have to travel from to Calais, and a note for us to show to a taxi driver explaining we wanted to go there with our luggage. So they were able to travel when they get to Paris, able to travel taxi to the other railway station, go to Calais, board the steamer crossing the English Channel, and they reached London Victoria Station on the 15th of October, 1938. He showed the address of Babu Singh from Malpur Baringham village, which is very close to the Diyar, who also lived in London, because all the letters addressed to my cousin, Gurbakh Singh, who was already living in the UK, were sent there. Saudagar Singh and his cousin took me to that address and left me with my luggage. We embraced each other and promised to keep in touch. Now, my father, with his cousin, gets registered as a peddler. So he starts working as a peddler. So he's saying that at that time, all the Sikhs that I knew were working as peddlers and sold their items to customers by walking from village to village or street to street in towns and knocking on the doors of a line of houses and trying to persuade them to buy something. In London, there were 8 Sikhs for Punjab, such as Babu Singh, who had rented entire houses themselves from English landlords. And in turn, they would sublet these houses by filling the rooms with double beds. The usual rate charged at that time was 4 shillings rent per week, and it meant sharing a double bed with another person. There were either 2 or 3 double beds in a room, so that each house would have over 20 men staying as lodgers at any time. A gas cooker was fitted on each landing by the bedrooms, and we would cook our own dal and rotis. And then he sort of says, well, outside London, a small group of men would do the same. And then he said the men living near London would go to the wholesalers each Wednesday in order to buy more stock, while those living further afield would come to London every fortnight or less frequently each month. After ordering the clothing goods for their business, these men would visit their friends and also see if there was any correspondence for them at one of these rental houses. People would often try and visit as many of these rental houses as possible in order to meet their friends and any new persons who had arrived there in England. And often they would stay for the night. In those days, if you went into a pub and there were other Sikhs who had arrived there before you, they would get up and buy a glass of beer and invite you to join them, even if you were a total stranger. Sitting there in those public houses and speaking together in Punjabi reminded me of the discussions we would have at the village gate in Dadial, or the chantas or platforms under the trees. People would always ask which district of Punjab you were from. And since it was usually the two districts of Jalandhar and Shahpur, then the next questions would always be about which village you came from and which villages your kinsmen lived in. Finding they knew or related, sometimes distantly, to people in common was often the starting point for many lifelong relationships. At that time, I do not think there were any Sikh women or families in England. So that's the sort of time he talks about. And he also says that there's another side to this. He said that there are relatively few people who are prospering in business as peddlers selling goods to customers. Many of the older persons would work a few hours each day, and they would spend most of their Sundays sitting in the cinemas watching English films, even though they might not understand much of what was being said. They were often over 50 years of age and had been away from their families of kinsmen for very long periods. In many cases, they were not able to remain in contact with their families because most of them were illiterate, so they had to rely on others to write on their behalf. Their income was often no more than £1, 10 shillings per week after expenses, and for some, it was literally a hand-to-hand level of subsistence in terms of paying for their costs and their meals. So that's the kind of reality in 1938. Fast forward, my father, after the war, because obviously people couldn't go anywhere, decides to go back to India in January 1948. I arrived in my home in Dadial on the 4th of February 1948 and was very pleased to see the new house that had been constructed during 1941. He'd sent money for this to be constructed. I also met Hira for the first time, and his role was to cut fodder in the fields, bring it to the house, and then provide it to the water buffaloes. Hira was a Muslim who had been born in and had lived all his life in the neighbouring village of Puriwal. He had not married, and although he was part of a Tilli oil crushing extended family, he had no steady income to rely on. He had come to our household about 6 years previously because he was seeking somewhere to live and work. And one of Chacha Hari Singh, so this was my father's uncle, friends had recommended him because he was reliable and honest. Hira began to look after the water buffaloes, and he was also undertake other tasks in the household when asked to do so. In return for this, he was treated as a member of the family and also received food and clothes as payment for his duties. Chacha Hari Singh also arranged for him to be appointed as a village chowkidar, a watchman, for which he received a small monetary sum from the authorities. Hira would parade around the entire village at night with his drum and shout to household they should lock up their doors and windows. I was told that during the period leading up to and when independence was achieved for India and Pakistan in August 1947, the Muslim families in Dadial and the surrounding villages had left for Pakistan. Although there had been no massacres of Muslim families in our village or the surrounding areas, there were stories of villages further afield where this had happened. This killing was also fueled by the stories of Sikh and Hindu refugees coming from Pakistan, talking about the killings they had seen themselves or had heard of. Hira had told his extended family in Puriwal that he was not going to Pakistan with them, and he also told Chacha Hari Singh that he wished to remain in the Dadial village with our family. Hira did not leave for Pakistan, although other people in the village were told that he had at that time, and he was kept hidden for the next 4 months in our family Haveli, where the water buffaloes were tied up at night. Chacha Hari Singh took on Hira's responsibilities as the village chowkidar. It was a time when gangs of youths with weapons were roaming around the countryside. Hira was kept hidden in case one of these gangs from outside the village came to hear of his presence and might then come to Dadial village in order to murder him. By Christmas 1947, the general situation in terms of law and order for the state of Punjab and the area around the Diyal village was now pacified, so there's no longer any threat to Hira or any other Muslim in terms of being killed, although by now there were virtually no Muslim families remaining in the area. Hari Singh had then told the village panchayat that Hira had not in fact gone to Pakistan, and they agreed to confirmation of his appointment again as the village chowkidar. Now Hira, I saw him, met him when I first went as a young child in 1961, and Hira continued to live with the family, and he received food and clothing and accommodation, even when he was too infirm to work on the farm or work as a chowkidar, and he passed away in October 1967. So that was, our experience in terms of family's experience in terms of the partition. The other thing I wanted very briefly to do was to sort of talk about two very short vignettes now about my father's involvement with organised thing. My father, in 1938, after a peddler, when the war started, decided that he could earn more money working as a labourer on army camps on Salisbury Plain. So he and a few other Punjabis went there. One of his friends, Atma Singh, told me that he'd received letters from his friends in Coventry who told him to come there because he'd be able to find employment. And once he was successful in doing this, he promised to write to us about employment opportunities in Coventry. He did so a few weeks later. Once construction work on the army camp had been completed at the beginning of May 1940. Hello. Sorry. Hello.
Carry on, Karamjit. I think.
Sorry. Okay. Darshan Singh, right. Darshan Singh and I returned to London, and from there we travelled to Luton. We had left our bicycles and some clothes at the houses of one of our regular customers where we'd been peddlers. From Luton, we set off early in the morning and cycled to Coventry, which is a distance of about 70 miles, and arrived there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Whilst we were working at the army camp, we became aware that Udham Singh, who all of us knew and called Baba because that was his nickname, had gone to a public meeting held at Caxton Hall in London on the March 13th, 1940, where the main speaker was Sir Michael O'Dwyer. He had been the governor of the Punjab province in April 1919, when General Dyer had ordered his Gurkha troops to shoot at hundreds of men, women and children taking part in a peaceful demonstration at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar city. Udham Singh had stood up in this public meeting and shot Sir Michael O'Dwyer dead, and had then stood still so that he should be arrested. Soon after I arrived in Coventry, the Hindustani Mazdoor Sabha, or IWA, held a meeting on a Sunday and was well attended by Punjabis living in Coventry and nearby towns. We discussed the collection activity on behalf of Udham Singh's defence, and also resolved that the association would have two main objectives. The first was to campaign for the independence of India from the British Raj, and the second was to provide a welfare service to members so they could settle here in England with no problems. This was important because the majority of Punjabis were literate not only in English, but also in the Urdu and Gurmukhi scripts for the Punjabi language, as well as not being able to speak fluently in English. At the association's meeting, I was proposed and elected as welfare officer. At 26 years of age, I was one of the youngest persons in the Punjabi community at the time. And as the welfare officer, I would assist fellow members by interpreting on their behalf in all their dealings with official agencies, as well as writing letters on their behalf to their families in India or elsewhere to relatives and friends. And then my final excerpt is jumping ahead to 1959. And he says, I received a letter from the City Council Corporation informing me that I should report for work on the 1st of April 1959 when a new car park would be opening. So he was working in the city centre. And he said that on the days when the Coventry Market, this is 1959, on the days when the Coventry Market was open, some Punjabi women would come into the city centre. By this time, the Punjabi community in Coventry and elsewhere was slowly growing because of a demand for labouring workers to do the hard, dirty and heavy jobs in the foundries for which it was difficult to recruit English workers. Some of them had sent for their wives to come and join them, but at this stage, the majority of people in the Punjabi or Sikh community were still men. The women would shop in the city centre, and if they met other Punjabi women there, they would stop and begin talking to them. In those days, few men could speak English fluently, and virtually no women, including my wife Chandan Kaur, could speak any English beyond a few words. In our homes, we spoke Punjabi with each other and our children. I noticed that when these women would stand in front of the market stalls or some of these shops and talk together in a group, they would be moved on because the market stall owners or shop owners thought that it was bad for their business if a group of non-English women stood there speaking in their own language. I heard some of the market stall owners say, "You do not buy anything, and if you stand here, we do not want you to spoil our other customers." Chandan Kaur also told me that many women met there in the city centre, that although many women met there in the city centre, they could not meet each other by visiting their houses because their husbands had no links with each other or were not on speaking terms. Because of the welfare work I was doing on behalf of individual members of the community by acting as interpreter and filling in various forms, I also knew that people were having difficulties in organising weddings or a conference. No women in the community were working at that time because they could not speak English, and many had young children. With their husbands at work during the day, they were often at home by themselves and felt very isolated because they could only speak a few words of English with their neighbours. Because of these factors, I began to feel that we should establish a Gurdwara or Sikh temple which could cater for the needs of the Sikh community in Coventry. And he sort of goes on to explain how he used to go and attend a school sessions in Smethwick at a school, religious gatherings, and he utilised those individuals to really take forward the idea of establishing a temple, which ends up being the Harnell Lane Sikh Temple in Coventry. I've used these excerpts really to kind of illustrate how, he was a pioneer. I felt I'm very proud of him, obviously, in a personal sense, but I'm very proud of his generation. As I said, they laid the foundations for us. But the difficulties, remember, this is an age where people have got problems with literacy. There's certainly no mobile phones. You can't kind of contact. And elsewhere in his book, he says that it used to take up to 5 months to get a response back from letters when they were sent to India. So during wartime, very difficult. And you can imagine the sense of isolation, the hardships that people faced. And obviously it was largely a male community at that time. But then you can see with that final excerpt, the point that really you're getting family groupings developing, family reunification, wives and families coming over. But then the other important part of all this is actually organised activity, that the Indian Workers Association, religious institutions, etc., are a very important part of it. I've probably spoken too much and probably I ought to stop there.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, in some ways, eclectic mix of comments and quotes from the book that you've written, which accounts your dad's story coming to this country and obviously previously. I think if I may just start with my own kind of reflections. Obviously I found it very a compelling book because I don't often read things or see things that I can have a very personal link with. And I, as you know, that my own family came to this country in 1931-34, and then during the war settled in Coventry. So for many aspects of the book, it was very interesting for me, and a whole new kind of revelation of what some of my family may have gone through. And so I personally, I wanted to kind of thank you for that. Wanted to, and you've talked about the illiteracy and sense of identity. I just wondered if you could just, I know that some people have got questions, so I could just ask my question first, Chair's prerogative. I was wondering if you could just expand on your father and others. I think particularly when he was working at the army bases, if I've got that right, and he was quite often questioned about why he hadn't joined the army, and he and a number of others had chosen to be conscientious objectors. And I was wondering if you could just explain, give an example of that in terms of migration, but also identity and nationalism and sense of, who they were as Indians, etc.
Yes, I mean, I think that he was asked this, and in fact, he had to move jobs at least once because of this, because the views of his generation were firstly influenced by what Udham Singh had done. Udham Singh, after all, had shot dead this individual some 21 years after the Amritsar massacre, and I think that in his book, he sort of said that the influence of that incident alone meant that he and his generation felt that the British no longer had a moral right to remain in as rulers in India. And then I think the other sense was obviously the growth of nationalism. Now, his view was that what happened was, you see, that when World War was declared, you had dominions like Canada and Australia, where their parliaments actually took the decision. They voted on it. What happened in India's case was that the Viceroy basically just declared war on behalf of India. No Indians were consulted in this. So now he and his colleagues sort of saw this really as a war between two basically imperial powers, as it were, at the time, as it were, and did not see this as their war. Now, they ended up contributing to the war effort because they were working in foundries that were producing war materials. I mean, they were producing castings for airplane engines, as it were, but they had that really strong sense, and your point, I think, is really well taken. I just have to add it with a personal vignette. I mean, like other Punjabi children, I'm sure you will be aware of this. You're always sent off to the library every week to kind of read books drummed into you. You've got to read your books. I think the issue that's really important is that I remember when I was 8 coming back, and he'd always ask me, "What books have you brought?" I said, I brought back a book about Winston Churchill. He was a great man. And I always remember this. He said, no, he said he is not a great man. I was too young to understand this at the time. I was kind of quite puzzled, but I now understand, the sort of comments. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
No, that again, that resonates with my own experience when my great-grandfathers told me that he didn't respect Winston Churchill, and I was horrified. I was saying, no, he's this great man, saying, no, I didn't seem like that. And I said, why? And he said, because he want India to be independent. And I thought, gosh, yes, I can see it from your perspective. But it really made me think about, for those of us, especially those who was born and brought up in Britain, the kind of sense, the stories and the positions and narratives in whose interest we get fed. There's a question here from Hardish. Hardish, thank you for your question. I was wondering if you wanted to ask it yourself, so we can make this more of an interactive session. If not, thank you.
Hi, Kindy. Thank you very much, and thank you, Karamjit. I mean,
So you can't put your camera on.
Sorry.
Oh, to put my camera on. Oh, I've been asked to put my camera on. Okay, okay, I'll put my camera on.
Nice to see you.
Hello, hi, Karamjit, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I mean, Karamjit, I mean, I think the book's fascinating. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. And just listening to you go through your father's experiences, just, you know, to me, it really touches my family's history as well. But we've discussed this before. From my perspective, it's really important that these stories are anchored into our everyday lives, but more importantly, or just as importantly, that there's a whole generation that is not aware of these quite important stories. So how do you engage your children and your grandchildren with these very important stories? Thank you.
Well, I think that it's fair to say it's work in progress with the grandchildren, because they're between the ages of 10 to 6. So I think you've got to kind of recognise that there's an alternative narrative, and I think we're seeing this now, aren't we? That actually British history, as taught in schools, needs to be changed from a colonial emphasis on colonialism to actually having these alternative views. I think my son certainly understands this. I mean, and we've talked about this, and he understands this. But I do think that there are still probably many young people of my son's generation who don't appreciate this. And I think, and I would also, if I may, look to Kindy here as cabinet member for education. I really do think we have to think about the way we teach history, because I'm someone who has really come to this from having had a education, during the 50s and 60s, which was very much rooted in the colonial experience. I really think that the kind of projects and the work that, for example, Hardish is doing, in terms of the archives, I think, there's a real issue here, and it's a broader question. How do we ensure that our children, grandchildren, indeed great-grandchildren, actually understand this legacy? How can we sustain this type of work? And I think that's really important. It's got to be events like this, programs like this during the day. But I think we need to be thinking about how do we have, for example, something like Living Museum. I mean, when you think you've got in other parts of the country, the Black Country Living Museum, for example, we need to have Living Museum or other ways that we can actually, and indeed our local museums ought to be regularly putting on things which our children and so forth can actually see. I hope that sort of tries to answer part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's a really excellent question, Hardish and Karamjit. Really making us think about not only for our own children but the wider community about what we do. And I with Warwick University, particularly Dr. Shanaza, we held the first ever UN conference first ever conference on colonial legacies, etc. And it was in Coventry, and it was with young people, school children in Coventry. And the way they talked about tracing slavery, for example, Coventry, their own sense of identity and pride in Coventry, to slavery in India. And these are kids that don't go to privileged schools, etc. They're just normal Coventry kids going to state schools, etc. And the contributions that they made to that conference in terms of speeches, poems, stories, music was just phenomenal. And I think it's as you say, Karamjit, it's those sorts of events and these sorts of events that really it is about taking forward and instilling that sense of, if we know the stories, so we have that sense of pride and identity in ourselves, which once we can carry through in all aspects of our lives. I see that Jagdish has a hand up. Can I just quickly ask a question from Verinder, who's unfortunately unable to ask the question themselves because they're having to look after their mum. And if I just read out his question first, and I'll you after, Jagdish.
Yeah.
Okay. So Verinda says, I've been lucky enough to read this book, and I wondered if Karanjit could just talk a bit about the process of translating it and how other people who may want to document their family stories may go about it themselves.
I mean, this was done. Remember, this was all written down in 1972, and people of my father's generation who went to school, Urdu was the language that they learned, and he was always comfortable in that. In fact, you know, he even his Punjabi prayers, he would write it down in Urdu. That was although he could write Gurmukhi, but that's he was comfortable with. Now I'm conscious that was a written version. We now have the technology, of course, where you could tape it. You know, you could just simply tape the conversations. And one of my regrets, I have to say, is because my mother, like many women of her generation from rural communities, was completely illiterate. I mean, she could simply write her name in English in block capitals and her name in Gurmukhi, and that was it. And I mean, I do regret. I had conversations with her. And some of those conversations have been fed into this book. But what I haven't got, unfortunately, is, you know, because you didn't have the technology at the time, you know, in the same way that you can have dictaphones or even mobile phones, you can record these. So what I would encourage is you know, time is passing on. You know, I mean, I had been very struck how during the pandemic, the number of people of that generation who have passed on, and you know, of course, people will remember snippets of conversations they've had, etc. But there's no substitute for methodically just start talking to your parents and grandparents and actually talk to them about their lives, you know, and what it was like when they were living in India, what it was like when they came here, and what were the issues that they struck. Just record it. And if you do that first, you know, I mean, it's now possible, isn't it, and I mean, I'm not I'm a bit of a technophobe myself, but I understand you can take these and you can link it up to computers and actually run it down, you know, but you know, even if it's in Punjabi, you know, it will be possible, you know, to get it translated. And I think that we were very lucky because we had someone, and he sadly, Veer Sarpal, he sadly passed away in March this year, but he was originally from our village. And he also, like my father, I mean, he passed away at the age of 91. He also, Urdu was his first language, but he came here, he was educated, he worked as a community relations officer, so he was able to translate it and provide me with a very good sort of basis on which to work. So please, you know, our community needs these stories. Your family needs these stories. Your children and grandchildren need those stories.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, and you're right. And I think particularly, you know, women's stories. You know, like women like my mum who came in the 50s. You know, what were their experiences of cooking, shopping, buying clothes, and having children, giving birth, and all those sorts of experiences that we don't really hear about when we hear of stories of migration, etc. Women's stories are particularly a lot. And just for information, I did some research on the Windrush scandal, and somebody on there was talking about how they looked at Ancestry.com and had found their father's voyage, and I'd always thought those sorts of websites wouldn't include my kind of my ancestors, but I did go onto it, and I did find my great grandfather's voyage, and I did find my dad's voyage as well.
Really?
And I did. So I found the actual. You know, so I did know that my great grandfather had gone to Dundee first and worked there as a peddler. So those sorts of things, you can look up those shipping details. They are all there, which have all the dates and names of people. So please, it's free, I think, for first 2 weeks.
Oh, well, that's a
Provided
useful.
that-
Well, I think that, well, that's really, really, really important. Can I say that just to add to one thing, I also believe this. I think that, you know, your point about putting down the experiences of women is really important, because I personally think in any community, I think women have got a key role in the whole issue of identity. I really do. And I think that, and I think, you know, we also have to make, and I'm guilty of this in this book, because I've focused on my father, you know, and that is one of my regrets, that I didn't collect it, but my father, in a sense, provided the raw material by writing it down, you know, that, but I think that's really important.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to, I noticed that Jagdish had their hands up, earlier. Jagdish, are you able to ask your question, please? Apologies for you having to wait, sorry.
No, that's fine. Not those points are really interesting. I agree. I mean, I'm doing research at Coventry, and the women are so important because the men tell a certain story, but I think the women, because they know a lot of the gossip, will tell you what really happened. And I think they have so much detail in their heads. That's really. I have two questions. The first one's a simple: is where can I get the book? Because I've never actually read it. And the second one is this thing about when you're looking. Because I'm doing research on the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but when you're looking back on, and people talk about themselves, if this history is related to identity, there is such a fixation in 1947. And what you talk about in that period between 1942 and 1947, no one really talks about a lot. And because it was such a difficult period, and the British have hidden so much of that history, and because in the post-independence period, people didn't want to look back, a lot of that history is largely unknown. I did a project with soldiers, Indian soldiers, and I mean, they knew in 1942 there was a shortage of food, but they didn't know there's mass starvation and mass hunger in that period. And there's this period between 1942 and 1947 where there's like a mass famine and 4 million people die. There's mass incarceration of most sensible liberals, not just nationalists, most sensible liberals. So the only people who are out are sort of very hardline religious supporters of the British state. And there's quite a lot of gangs. And there's also the censorship of the press for that period. And it's almost like India in that 5 years becomes a failed state. It was almost inevitable violence was going to happen. And and because it's, when you ask your parents, they don't necessarily know that, because they haven't gone and looked at the archives, and not many people have. It's almost quite difficult to talk about ourselves through a lens of censorship and a history that hasn't really been opened up in a way. So it's difficult to then make an identity for yourself based on 1947, because 1947 in itself doesn't make sense unless you talk about the bigger history. And I'm just wondering, there is so much work to be done looking back, because I think all we can do in each generation is unpick the story a little bit more. I hope somebody else will unpick it a bit more as things become. So I'm glad you're talking about that period more. I think we do need to talk about that period as a period more.
Yeah, I mean, just I've put my email on the chat, so you know, perhaps we can catch up. You know, obviously. Separately, you know, about how to get hold of the book. I think in terms of the point you're making, I mean, obviously some people will be interested in these issues from an academic perspective. The thing I'm aware of is that clearly for me, at that time, it was curiosity, and it was also because I was born and bred here. I'd been to India 3 or 4 times, but I've been raised in a family context where, you know, your heritage, you know, and your ability to speak in Punjabi and, you know, go to the Gurdwara regularly and something and all the rest of it was certainly part of my upbringing, as it were. And my father was very much into, you know, links with the community, as it were. So that was so it's partly curiosity. It's now, you know, got to the point now where I'm thinking about it, you know, more. I was thinking about it more as a legacy issue, because of responsibility, for, you know, my responsibility, and I'm already. I mentioned this to Kindy the other day. One of my other thoughts now is how I can change this book into something that could be useful for school children. Because I think that a slimmed down version, if you like, but obviously because I think we owe it to our children, our next generations. Think about that. But the point you're making is a really important one. History. Who is history written by, and how do we think about history, as it were? And it touches on the point that Kindy made. People of my father's generation were very staunch nationalists. They may not have had the information, but they certainly had a very clear view of where they stood on the big issues of the time, as it were. Thank you for that.
Thanks for that, Karamjit. Thanks for that insight, Jagdish. Look forward to hearing more about your research. Dad Kaur, I understand that you would like to ask a question. And just bearing in mind we've got about another 7 minutes. I know we could carry on for longer, and I'd love to, but just bearing in mind how short of time. So please, Dav, ask your question.
No, thank you for giving me time, Kindy. Karamjit, really listening to your story, I just want to add it resonated to me because I came in this country in 2004, but my dad was born as a refugee from Pakistan. So my grandmother was pregnant, and when they moved from Lahore, they were in Sialkot when
Right. Yeah.
he's born in 1947 as a refugee. And then we became a second-time refugee in 1984. So my family has actually seen the uphill of Sikh community and how we were treating, not once, but twice. And what my question is that, as everybody has been talking about, you just said that how history is portrayed and how is it said. In India, I know it's been whitewashed right now. Everything has been whitewashed. We can see that how the history has been rewritten over there. But my question to you is that how you people haven't lived that experience, and you are getting it from the people who have lived it, like your dad and everybody else. And it's not your history, it's your heritage, because you're not born there. You said there is a 3. So are you trying to, I don't know how to ask you this one, but I just don't want you people to write the history where you don't have a lived in experience. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I'm conscious of time. Let me try. Let me try and help you there. Our father, the one thing he did was to take me and my siblings regularly to India. That's one thing. So he bought a farm. We still have the farm. And 5 years ago, I went back, and I used to go regularly. For a decade, each year, I personally sponsored and financed a medical camp, a free medical camp, over 3 days in the village, where my parents came from. And 5 years ago, I renovated the 1941 house, as it were, so that because I want, and that was at the encouragement of my son, because I wanted my son and his family to go regularly, because I think that we do interact here with people who come from the same village. We go to weddings, festivals, sadly, more commonly now it's funerals as well, but so there are those links, you can, you may not physically live there all the time, but you can have a concept of having some of those links. Now, for some families, those links have weakened because most of the people have come here. That's the point I think you're making. And it is a very important point. But I think the thing is, heritage and having pride in your heritage, I think doesn't necessarily mean that you all have to go all the time. I mean, I think we're lucky we've got that link at the moment, and we have some distant relatives there. But I think it is an important issue that you've raised. My own wife, who's sadly passed away now, was a first-generation migrant. It was it was an arranged marriage, and it was a marriage that you know, it was a very happy marriage, you know, but it was interestingly, it was a marriage that came from the friendship that my father had with my wife's uncle, who'd arrived here in 1935. You know, in other words, you know, it was one of these lifelong friendships, as it were. So I think that, you know, relationships are very important, but I also think that you don't have to physically live there. I think you can do that, and I understand the point you make. I mean, I think that, you know, people have had, you know, you talk about two upheavals your family's had. I'm very conscious, for example, that there are people who migrated to India during 1947, and some people who went to East Africa. And it's important that some of those people had to leave from Uganda and certainly Kenya and so forth. So, I think forced migration is also an issue. The important thing is that we must tell our stories. Our children and their group and their grandchildren need to understand, you know, this is part of their history. Yeah. And thank you for your point.
Thank you, Karamjit. And I think, you know, certainly for those of us who have had their education are in that privileged position, if you like, to write those stories down, whereas others who did come before us, who have lived that experience, but didn't have the means or even the time or resources to be able to write their stories down. And so I think for this book in particular, because Karamjit's father, Dar Singh, had written the notes, it is in essence his voice that is coming through in this book, and it's a really important question. Thank you, Dav. I know that we've got 1 minute left, and I just wanted to highlight that Verinder has made some video recordings for this project, and which feature two Punjabi women authors, Jasveer Kang and Kailash Puri. So hopefully we'll be able to see those later on. I know that we've got one final minute before we finish, and I just feel I'd like to give that last minute to you, Karamjit, just to give us 30 seconds or so. Sorry, it's only 30 seconds. I just realised it's 11 o'clock.
I suppose, again, just to come back to the word pioneer, I mean, to me, you know, this session is a building block for the rest of the day's program. The important thing is that identity is not constant. Identity can change. But the important thing for me, and why I was really keen on this, is that I've reflected on this. I never knew when I had these conversations with my father in 1972 that it would turn out this way. And that I'm now looking backwards, but I'm also looking forwards and thinking about legacy. And I think what's really important is that all of us try to capture as much as we can in relation to our own families, our own histories, but also let's all think about our collective responsibility. How do we make sure that we can get future generations to be aware of their legacy? That, for me, I think that's why I've been really interested in this, because, you know, as you get older, you do start thinking about legacy from a different perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I guess people, if you want to hear more, get a whole copy of the book, please write to Karamjit. He's put his email in the chat. So thank you so much, Karamjit, first of all, for making the effort of writing this book and giving people like myself the privilege to read. It's absolutely fascinating, and I really do recommend the book. So thanks to you. Thanks to all of you for attending. And also my final thanks to ArtSpace Coventry. You know, I get to do the nice job of sitting in front of you and asking all the questions and inviting people in. But for this to happen, lots of people behind the scenes have spent a lot of time making this happen. And so my thanks to ArtSpace Coventry for all of the hard work that you've put in today. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of the sessions. And thank you for attending, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Kindy and Karanjit. Sorry, I thought I was on mute, but Hardish and I are both here with our computers, so we've had to figure out the audio. So thank you everybody so much for coming along. Please do. I have put in the chat the evaluation and links to other things happening today. We'll leave it open for a few minutes. So if you want to look through the chat to pick up Karanjit's email about his book, or any of the links to other things going on today, or the evaluation, you'll have time to do that. So just leave whenever you like, and I'll close the meeting in about 5 minutes. And thank you everybody for coming. It would be nothing.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I have to go because I have to go and look after my mum in Birmingham. So, okay. Take care. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much, Karamjit, and everybody. I would be leaving now.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Karanjit.
I will email you about the book, and would love to have see where I can get the copy of your book.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Thank
thank you. Karanjit. That's fantastic. That's a really good start to the day.
Yeah, it has been. It's been right. It's really. Sorry, because the only thing is, Karamjit, as I said in my question also, that what I hope is that, you know, the information we have in our heads now, it should be actually documented properly, because there are powers over here who are rewriting our histories as they want to, and those powers are more prevalent because they are more louder, because they have got more resources. And what my always is that the real stories, like your dad's story and my dad's story and other stories, millions of them, if they're not documented in time, we will be lost. And then that's the only sad part I feel myself, you know, that.
Yeah, and can I say that, because I'm conscious of time, but you know, we were all taught history about kings and queens. I think the issue is history is about ordinary people. Ordinary people make history, and you know, this is why I use the term at the beginning. For me, this is a contribution to British social history, and I think that's how we should be talking about this, really.